You ever met a man who beat his HOA with nothing but a barn, a Bible verse, and a federal statute? Well, you're about to drop a comment below if you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought it was the Supreme Court, because this isn't just a story about one man's land. It's about drawing a line and daring them to cross it. They say retirement's supposed to be peaceful. I pictured long mornings, black coffee on a wooden porch, and the satisfying creak of a rocking chair. What I didn't expect was a war over a barn. My name's Walter Griggs. I'm 62 years old, a retired high school history teacher, and apparently, I'm now public enemy number one in the eyes of a suburban HOA with too much time and even more entitlement on its hands. Let me explain. It all started the day after my father's funeral. We buried him on a windy October afternoon beneath the same oak tree he planted when I was 8. My sister cried. I didn't. Not because I wasn't grieving, but because I knew the man well enough to know what he'd want: dignity, not drama. He was a stubborn old mechanic, loyal to his tools, his land, and very little else, especially not to anything that smelled of authority, especially not to the HOA. Dad left me 1.8 acres just outside of Deerwood Crossing, a quiet corner of a county that hadn't been quiet since they built that blasted golf course next door. On that land stood two things of value. 1. A 2-bedroom ranch house built in 1953. 2. A leaning, rust-red, cedar-sided barn built by my grandfather with his own 2 hands. The house was in good shape. The barn well. The barn had character, warped shingles, a door that didn't fully close, a weather vane stuck perpetually pointing east. But it was ours. After the funeral, I told my sister I'd be staying for a while, a few months, maybe a year, just to get things in order. I didn't know yet that I wouldn't be leaving, nor did I know that getting things in order meant preparing for battle. The first week, I got to work, cleaned out the barn, dusted off the old workbench, found Dad's tool chest, still full, hung up a lantern and brought in a few folding chairs. I started parking my truck under the overhang and using the inside space to tinker with a broken riding mower that had been sitting idle since Bush was president. Eventually, I strung up some lights, installed a small heater, and set up a kettle for afternoon tea. It became, well, my spot. And for a while, it was perfect, until the letters came. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope with raised lettering and an official-looking logo featuring a leaf, a flag, and a gavel. Dear Mr. Griggs, we hope you're settling in well at your new residence. Deerwood Crossing is proud of its aesthetic harmony and community standards. Unfortunately, your property has recently been found in violation of Article 4, Section 3B of the Community Standards Manual, unapproved outbuildings, sheds, or accessory structures not conforming to architectural guidelines. Specifically, your red barn appears to fall outside of acceptable color palettes, structural proportions, and placement guidelines. You are hereby notified to remove or fully enclose the structure within 14 days or face further enforcement actions. I stared at the letter. Then I stared at the barn. It had been there for 73 years. Suddenly, it was an unapproved outbuilding. I wrote back, politely, explained that the barn was built decades before the HOA was even formed, explained that the land wasn't inside the HOA's boundary, as shown clearly on the county plat map, enclosed copies of the deed, a land survey, and a grainy photo of my father in front of the barn in 1965 holding a wrench and a beer. They didn't respond. Instead, I got a second letter. Violation persists. Further noncompliance may result in fines, property liens, and legal action. They attached a photo of me sitting in a lawn chair beside the barn, zoomed in with a timestamp. I started documenting everything: dates, mail, who was walking by, who was parked across the street for too long. I wasn't paranoid. I was being prepared. My father always said, "Don't wrestle pigs. You both get muddy and the pig likes it." But this wasn't a pig. This was a petty dictatorship disguised as a neighborhood committee. It was around then I met Karen Delaney. Yes, her real name was actually Karen. She introduced herself as president of the Deerwood Crossing Homeowners Association. She wore a pastel pantsuit, pearl earrings, and a smile so tight it could have cut wire. "I'm sure you understand," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the barn. "That appearances matter?" "I thought that was mostly in high school," I replied. Her smile didn't waver. "We want to help you bring your property up to code." "It's not under your code. Technicalities can be litigated. Harmony, however, cannot." That's when I realized something important Karen wasn't here to ask. She was here to win. The next week, HOA volunteers knocked on my door to hand-deliver architectural harmony recommendations, a color swatch packet, a pamphlet titled Modernizing Rural Structures, and a note reminding me that refusing to conform may affect future appraisals. I didn't answer. I just watched from the porch with my dog, Cricket, as they walked away. Cricket growled. I scratched her head. "Me too? Girl?" Things escalated. HOA compliance officers started photographing the barn from the sidewalk, then from the neighbor's backyard. Then from my backyard, one even claimed he was checking for snakes. I called the sheriff. He said unless there was a sign clearly marking the boundary, there wasn't much he could do. HOAs have a way of getting enthusiastic, he added. "Yeah," I said. "Well, I'm starting to get there myself." By the end of month 1, I'd received 5 letters of violation, 1 cease and desist, 3 unannounced wellness checks from code enforcement, and an anonymous flyer in my mailbox that read, "Barns belong on farms not in our community." And still, I hadn't even painted the thing. But the real twist came when I checked the HOA's public meeting minutes posted online under community development plans. There, in black and white, was a proposal, Phase 3 expansion recommendation, acquire adjacent lots to complete the Lifestyle Commons footprint. Notably, the Griggs parcel currently obstructs trail loop development and multi-purpose pavilion zoning. Suddenly, the violation letters made sense. They didn't care about aesthetics. They wanted the land, and I was in the way. That night, I sat in the barn with Cricket at my feet and a copy of the Constitution in my lap. Just habit, I guess. 35 years teaching civics makes you reach for parchment when pressured. And that's when the idea first sparked. A half-formed thought, an itch behind the ear. What if this barn wasn't just a building? What if it stood for something bigger? Not just memory, not just heritage, but purpose. And if the HOA wanted a fight, well, I was done sipping tea. Time to start preaching. You'd think after the first few letters, they'd run out of things to complain about. You'd be wrong. By week 5, I had a dedicated drawer labeled HOA, Nonsense and Threats. Inside it, 2 violation warnings for unapproved color tone visible from the street. 1 citation for excessive auditory disturbance due to tool usage. A particularly creative complaint titled Visual Disruption Caused by Irregular Roof Pitch. And my personal favorite, potentially offensive signage observed. That signage was an old wooden plaque nailed to the barn door that read, "Griggs Tools and Truth, open when I feel like it." Apparently, that was grounds for HOA panic. Each letter came in the same heavy envelope, printed in 12-point Times New Roman, and signed by either Karen Delaney herself or one of her compliance ambassadors. That's what they called themselves, compliance ambassadors. Like some kind of bureaucratic Peace Corps, except their mission was to enforce shrub height and suppress individuality. They'd walk by in khakis and HOA polos, holding clipboards like they were sacred scrolls. I saw one of them measuring my grass with a literal ruler. Another tapped my fence post with a level and frowned. I considered offering them lemonade, but I didn't want to encourage the wildlife. Then came the flyer, folded in thirds, unmarked envelope, delivered to several of my neighbors. It read, "Deerwood deserves better. Do you want rusting barns, oil stains, and country clutter ruining our peaceful streets? Say no to declining property values. Say no to backyard businesses. Say yes to community harmony. Call the HOA hotline today if you see anything unusual." Underneath, a blurry zoomed-in photo of my barn. And yes, it was in black and white, like some kind of 1950s anti-subversion propaganda. One of my neighbors, Cheryl, brought it to me personally. "I thought you should know," she said, handing it to me over the fence. They didn't even sign it, just left them in mailboxes. I studied the flyer for a moment, then looked up. "You want to see the oil stain they're so worried about?" She smiled. "Lead the way." Inside the barn, I gave her the tour, tools on pegboards, fresh wood stacked for winter, old truck half disassembled in the corner, and yes, a small patch of oil beneath it. "I think the neighborhood will survive," she said. Cheryl wasn't the only one. As the flyers spread, so did curiosity. 2 more neighbors came by just to say hi. One brought me cookies. Another asked if I'd help him fix his lawnmower. HOA had tried to isolate me, but all they did was advertise. Karen didn't like that, so she brought out the big guns. Literal ones. Drone surveillance? No, I'm not joking. One morning I walked outside to find a small quadcopter buzzing near my roofline. It hovered, dipped, snapped a photo, then zipped off toward the HOA clubhouse 3 blocks over. I stood there in my bathrobe and waved. The drone did not wave back. I sent Karen a letter of my own. "Dear Mrs. Delaney, if you wish to observe my barn, feel free to stop by during daylight hours. But if your flying robot so much as touches my property again, I will exercise my right to defend it against unauthorized surveillance under state drone trespass law, 14-02 BG. Sincerely, Walter Griggs, proud barn owner, defender of privacy, occasional biscuit baker." I attached a copy of the state law with highlighted passages and a doodle of a drone wearing a top hat. Never got a response. But the drone didn't come back. That week, the violations escalated. Karen accused me of operating a commercial enterprise due to increased foot traffic. What traffic? 2 neighbors asking for help with a weed whacker. She claimed the barn was being used in a manner inconsistent with residential zoning expectations. I replied with a map of the county zoning overlay, which clearly showed my land was unincorporated agricultural residential. She accused me of public gatherings without permit. I reminded her that Sunday tea with my sister and Cricket the dog didn't qualify as a riot. But it was her next move that crossed the line, a letter, this time certified, notice of escalation. The Deerwood Crossing. HOA has voted unanimously to pursue legal action should noncompliance continue. You are hereby given 10 business days to cease unauthorized structure usage and return the building to storage-only designation, or face an enforcement suit under Article 7, Section 12. She was trying to sue me for using my own barn. I called my old college friend, Nathan Pierce, who now ran a small real estate law office. He read the letter, then laughed for a full minute. "They can't touch you. Walter, you're outside their jurisdiction, so why are they acting like I'm inside it? Because they're betting you won't fight back." He paused. "But I know you. Damn right you do." Nathan helped me draft a notice of non-jurisdictional immunity. It outlined, with citations, the plat map showing I was never part of the HOA, the county's own land records, a formal rejection of their enforcement authority, and a polite but firm reminder that continued attempts could be considered harassment. I sent it via registered mail. Karen signed for it herself. I know, because I still have the receipt. 1 week later, I got a final notice due to your failure to cooperate with reasonable community expectations. The HOA will be exploring all legal avenues to compel compliance. Your behavior reflects a disregard for shared values and may subject your property to further regulatory review. I read it slowly, then I folded it neatly and tossed it into the wood stove. That night, I sat on the porch, Cricket at my feet, Cheryl sipping tea beside me. She looked out at the barn glowing softly under string lights. "You ever think about just painting it beige and calling it a day?" I smiled. "Nope." She laughed. "Good, that's what I figured." The HOA had fired their first real shot, and I didn't flinch, because I had something they didn't: history, law, and a righteous sense of sarcasm. And if they thought a few typed letters and a drone could scare me off, well, they were about to learn something new. You don't threaten a history teacher with paperwork. You invite him to make history. You don't fight this hard over a barn unless the barn is in the way. That thought settled into my mind one gray morning while I sat in the barn itself. Cricket curled at my feet. a copy of the HOA bylaws on my lap, and a fresh violation letter on the table beside me. They weren't just annoyed. They were orchestrating something. The letters were no longer about aesthetics or code violations. They were about escalation, cornering, wearing me down. And suddenly, I remembered something my father used to say. If the heat's rising and you didn't light the fire, someone's cooking behind your back. I decided it was time to check the stove. The clue came from a neighbor. Quiet guy. Name's Henry Morton. Accountant. Wore sandals with socks and never quite made eye contact. He stopped by as I was pruning the hedge line between my property and the walking path that curved in from the HOA-controlled subdivision. I probably shouldn't say anything, he muttered, standing awkwardly near the fence, but I figured you'd want to know. He handed me a paper-printed minutes from a recent HOA board meeting, found it on the community server before they took it down. They're not supposed to delete these things. You know, open meeting laws. I looked at the page, and just like that, the picture came into focus. There, tucked between line items on lawn treatments and newsletter design, was the real bombshell Phase 3, Sorry-based expansion recommendation, finalize acquisition strategy for parcels adjacent to community lot, C. Remaining property, Griggs poses delay risk. Proposal for redevelopment includes Lifestyle Commons Initiative Clubhouse, Events Lawn, Yoga Garden, Commercial Annex, Griggs. That was me. My barn, my land, and apparently my future yoga garden. I reread it 3 times. They weren't just harassing me. They were planning to replace me. I asked Henry why he was showing me this. He shrugged. Because your dad helped me fix my roof after the hailstorm. Didn't even ask for anything. I figure you should at least get to fight fair. Then he walked off like he hadn't just handed me the blueprint to my own eviction. I stood there for a long while, watching the breeze ripple through the weeds, and for the first time, I wasn't just angry, I was focused. Later that day, I did what any history teacher with a Wi-Fi connection and a personal grudge would do. I started digging. Public records, county zoning applications, council minutes, property transfers, utility easements, and just like Henry's document suggested, a pattern emerged. Over the past 18 months, the HOA had been quietly buying up land adjacent to my parcel, old Mr. Kellerman's lot, which had been vacant since '02 sold. The Smith family's horse pasture donated to the HOA for community beautification, all of it forming a neat perimeter around my barn. They'd boxed me in, and now they wanted to finish the set. They'd even filed a community overlay proposal with the county planning office, a rezoning request that would allow for semi-commercial development on what was supposed to be a residential-only buffer zone. It was labeled under a pleasant title, Clearwood Commons, A Vision for Shared Space. I printed the map. My land was the only section marked in red. Across the bottom, in handwritten notes, acquire or remove obstacle before Q3. Obstacle. That's all I was to them. A barn-shaped problem. I sat in the barn that night, listening to the wind creak through the old beams, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not rage, not fear, purpose. The kind of purpose that gets you out of bed before dawn and makes your coffee taste like fuel. They had plans. So did I. The next morning, I went down to the county clerk's office with a folder under my arm and a half smile on my face. I wasn't filing a complaint. I was researching precedent. If they could exploit zoning loopholes and procedural gray zones, so could I. And what I found, after 3 hours and a helpful deputy clerk named Sandra, who liked crossword puzzles and hated HOA drama, was a little-known section of the county code. It concerned the preservation of historic agrarian structures. Turns out, any building over 70 years old that met certain criteria could be nominated for special status, limiting the ability of neighboring entities like HOAs to demand alteration or removal. Better yet, if said structure had a civic or cultural use, that protection was even stronger. That was the key. All I had to do was define the barn as a place of community cultural function, not a workshop, not a garage, something more meaningful. Then it hit me. Something they couldn't touch. Something they wouldn't dare touch. something protected by federal law. I smiled, and in that moment, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the county clerk's office, a simple idea took shape. An idea that would turn the HOA's expansion plan into a legal and public relations nightmare. If they wanted to make this about principles and codes, fine. Let's make it about faith. By the end of the day, I had filled out the necessary paperwork, registered a nonprofit entity, selected a name, and submitted an application for designation as a religious use site under the state's Faith-Based Community Use Act. The barn was no longer just a barn. It was now home to the HOA Free Fellowship, a registered community of practitioners of peaceful resistance, spiritual reflection, and personal sovereignty through craft and nature. I typed that sentence myself, smiled the whole time. Of course, I didn't need a congregation. The law didn't require one, just a space, a mission, and documentation. I had all three. What's more, I plan to make it real. A few folding chairs, a lectern made from reclaimed wood, weekly reflections on civil liberties, land use, and neighborly decency. A notice board outside listing service hours and themes like, let there be boundaries, render unto bureaucracy. What is bureaucracies? In the beginning was the land deed cricket, and I rehearsed the first sermon under a string of lanterns. She approved. I filed the paperwork, filed it properly, stamped, notarized, certified, and once it was processed, I sent Karen Delaney a copy. Attached was a simple note. Dear President Delaney, please be advised that the structure in question is now recognized as a house of worship under applicable county and state law. Any further attempts to restrict its use may be interpreted as an infringement on constitutionally protected religious practice. Grace and Peace, Reverend Griggs, founder, HOA Free Fellowship. I signed it in blue ink and underlined Reverend twice. That week, I hosted our first official gathering. 4 people came, 2 were curious, 1 brought banana bread, and 1 said, "You're my new hero." Then asked if I could help him file a complaint against the HOA for his banned wind chimes. We sat in a circle, we spoke quietly, we read selections from the Federal Housing Act, and when it ended, I stood beneath the rust-red beams of the barn, looked at my neighbors, and said, "You are welcome here, so long as you don't bring a clipboard." Everyone laughed, even me. Karen Delaney didn't respond to my letter right away. I expected confusion, maybe even silence. But what I got was an email titled, Urgent Misuse of Religious Protections. No salutation, no preamble. Just a block of text that read, "It has come to our attention that you are attempting to reclassify a non-conforming structure under the guise of religious use. If this is intended as a tactic to avoid compliance with HOA standards, please be aware that abuse of such protections may be subject to legal scrutiny. The Deerwood Crossing HOA reserves the right to consult with counsel." I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I smiled and wrote back, "Dear Ms. Delaney, my faith in personal liberty and private land stewardship is no guise. Kindly consult all the counsel you like. Sincerely, Reverend Walter Griggs, HOA Free Fellowship." She wasn't ready for what came next. I filed for tax-exempt status under 501c3 as a religious nonprofit. I submitted articles of incorporation to the Secretary of State, listing the purpose as to foster individual reflection, community resilience, and constitutional awareness through peaceful gatherings in a historic agrarian structure. I registered the barn as a place of worship under the county's zoning code. And most importantly, I invoked federal protection under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, RLUIPA. RLUIPA 42U, S.C. Barrevout 2000 cc. Prohibits land use regulations that place a substantial burden on religious exercise unless the government can show a compelling interest pursued in the least restrictive means. I wasn't just stalling. I was building a legal firewall. By week's end, a sign went up, HOA Free Fellowship. Sundays at 10:30, bring a chair, bring a mind. A few curious neighbors stopped to read it. One woman asked, "Is this real? As real as their pool house yoga studio?" I said. She nodded and said she'd bring cookies. Each Sunday came, our first official gathering. I wore a flannel shirt, dark jeans, and what might be mistaken for a clergy pin. If you squinted, 10 people showed up. 6 brought lawn chairs, 2 brought banana bread. I stood at a pulpit made from a reclaimed tractor axle and some old pallet wood. Behind me, the barn doors were open, the morning sun cutting through rafters older than anyone present. And I began. "Friends," I said, "welcome to this sacred space. A barn, yes, but also a sanctuary, a place where tools once hung, stories were told, and a man like my father fixed more than engines. He fixed lives." Pause. I stand here today not to sell salvation, but to protect something nearly as rare sovereignty. The right to live without being harassed for the color of your siding. The right to keep chickens if you damn well please. Light chuckles. This building now serves as our place of fellowship. We gather to reflect, to question, to preserve, to push back against paper tyrants and manicured uniformity. And as Scripture once said, "Blessed are the independent, for their zoning permits shall not be denied." The room laughed, and just like that, the first sermon of HOA Free Fellowship came to a close. Karen was not pleased. On Monday morning, I received a letter via courier, a full 3 pages, double-spaced, titled Notice of Invalid Assembly. She claimed the barn failed to meet occupancy and fire code standards for gatherings. She accused me of weaponizing loopholes. She cited Article 12.3.1 of the HOA bylaws, which according to her prohibited unauthorized religious activity in structures not approved for community use. That part made me chuckle. I wrote back, "Dear Ms. Delaney, thank you for your creative interpretation of the First Amendment. Unfortunately, the UMass Constitution, federal case law, and RLUIPA all disagree with your bylaws. I have attached a copy of our fire inspection certificate passed with commendation. Furthermore, please note that HOA authority does not extend to religious use on parcels outside your jurisdiction, as confirmed by county records. I recommend future correspondence be directed to our fellowship's legal advisor. In peace, Reverend Griggs." I CC'd Nathan. He CC'd a real religious liberties attorney out of Houston, just for flavor. Then the flyers began, anonymous again, dropped in mailboxes and pinned to community boards. "Beware fake churches. Don't be fooled by the barn cult," complete with a photoshopped image of me holding a pitchfork with glowing red eyes. I considered suing for defamation. Instead, I printed copies, laminated them, and hung them up inside the barn with the caption, "Proof of Faith." If they're scared, you're doing something right. Attendance doubled the next week. What Karen didn't understand and never would was that her aggression was fertilizer. Every insult, every flyer, every drone, it just made people more curious. And when people came, they found something honest, simple, warm. They found coffee and conversation. They found a community. One couple said it was the first time in months they'd felt not surveilled. And then came the media. A local paper ran a headline, "Retired Teacher Turns, Barn into Church to Block HOA Takeover." They sent a photographer, Cricket made the front page, Karen issued a formal statement to the press, accusing me of mocking religion to evade accountability. I responded with a quote from the RLUIPA handbook, published by the Department of Justice. Religious exercise is not limited to traditional denominations or edifices. The law protects sincere belief wherever it manifests. Source DOJ, RLUIPA Policy Statement, 2015. Then I added, "Our beliefs are simple. Leave your neighbors alone. Keep your grass honest. And never trust a woman with a clipboard and no soul." They ran that too. I received a visit from the county zoning officer, a polite man named Dave with a hard hat and a clipboard. I got a complaint about occupancy again. He said. I handed him the inspection report. He skimmed it, nodded, and looked around. "This place is solid. Older than the HOA," I said. "Older than me," he replied. He paused. "You're not really a pastor, are you?" I looked him dead in the eye. "I believe in something worth defending." He smiled. "That's more than I can say for some folks." He left with a blessing. That Sunday, I closed the gathering with a message. You may be mocked, you may be fined, you may be watched, but remember, freedom looks strange to people who traded theirs for conformity. The room applauded. Cheryl passed out scones. Someone sang an acoustic version of "This Land Is Your Land." Cricket barked along in key. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about a barn anymore. It was about the principle that built it, and the people who were now ready to protect it. Karen Delaney was unraveling. Not all at once, she was too polished for that. No, hers was a slow, methodical detonation. The kind that begins with extra meetings, blossoms into vague threats, and finally explodes across the local news in a blaze of self-righteous fury. And it all started because she couldn't stand losing control of one red barn with a cross made from rake handles nailed to the siding. The first crack came the week after our third Sunday gathering. Attendance had grown to over 30 people, some devout, some curious, some just looking for a space to breathe that didn't require them to sign in at the HOA front desk. Among them were families who had lived in Deerwood Crossing for a decade. Even the old couple from lot 118 who had once filed a noise complaint over wind chimes showed up with folding chairs and brownies. We didn't preach fire or brimstone. We preached boundaries and neighborly decency. Apparently, that was radical. That Monday, HOA issued a community bulletin. Be advised, unauthorized religious gatherings in non-zoned structures pose safety and legal risks to the community. Residents are encouraged to avoid participation until clarification is obtained. I replied publicly. Be further advised, federal law prohibits interfering with religious use of land. Residents are encouraged to participate in their democracy and bring muffins. That one got quoted in the local paper. Then it hit the radio. Then the HOA meeting livestream went viral because Karen lost it. She stood at the front of the rec center ballroom, palms white-knuckled on the podium, voice shaking with perfectly manicured rage. This is not a church. It's a protest disguised as piety. He's mocking faith. He's weaponizing religion to destabilize our governance. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Isn't that what popes used to do?" The laughter started small, then spread. By the end of the night, 5 members of the compliance committee had quietly resigned. Karen issued a formal grievance against each of them. Om Sigied. Then came the news crew. A CBS affiliate out of Austin sent a reporter to interview me. She was young, sharp, and didn't flinch when cricket barked. "So, you're saying this entire movement started with an HOA letter?" "No," I said. "It started with a barn. The letter just helped clarify the stakes." "Are you anti-HOA?" "I'm anti-people who forget they work for the neighborhood, not the other way around." She smirked. The segment aired that night. The next Sunday, we had 68 attendees. Karen did not. Desperate times breed desperate tactics. The HOA launched a whisper campaign that I was using the barn to run a militia, that I was stockpiling anti-government literature, that I was collecting money under the table. None of it stuck, because I was one step ahead. Nathan had already filed our nonprofit's public disclosures with the state. All funds accounted, no weapons. Just old hymnals, a copy of the Constitution, and a well-used coffee pot. Then, the signs appeared, dozens of them, nailed to HOA fences in common areas. Griggs is not a pastor, just a power-hungry liar. Barn Church don't drink the holy Kool-Aid. Someone printed them on weatherproof vinyl. Professionally done. I took one down and hung it in the barn next to the defamation flyer from before. I called it my wall of witness. Visitors started taking selfies in front of it. The harassment escalated. One morning, I found my mailbox smashed open. A few days later, someone poured roofing nails across my driveway. The barn was egged on a Friday night, but the real line crossing happened when my mother, who visited every other week, was followed home by a man in a black SUV with tinted windows. I called the sheriff. Deputy Adams came out, took notes, apologized, said his hands were tied unless I caught them on video. I already had. I uploaded the footage to our website under a new tab, What They're Afraid Of. Within an hour, it had over 3,000 hits. The next day, a journalist from a major online outlet emailed me asking for an interview. She wanted to feature our fight in a piece about land rights, HOA abuse, and religious freedom. I agreed, but I warned her. This isn't about one barn. It's about one rulebook trying to erase another. She smiled. Even better, Karen, seeing the coverage, tried to change tactics. She showed up to the barn unannounced, wearing sunglasses, a pressed blouse, and a smile like a wolf wearing lip gloss. "I thought perhaps we could talk," she said. "I don't talk off the record," I replied. She looked around. "This little movement of yours, it's dangerous. To whom? To order? To precedent? If everyone did what you did, they'd be free." Her jaw tightened. "You're not a pastor, and you're not a monarch." She didn't respond. She just turned, walked back to her Lexus, and peeled out hard enough to kick gravel at Cricket's feet. Cricket growled. We both watched her disappear. That week, HOA filed a formal petition with the county zoning board to revoke my property's conditional religious use status. Their claim that I had fraudulently weaponized federal protections to obstruct community development. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. I spent those weeks preparing, and I wasn't alone. Cheryl printed pamphlets. Mike Morton, the quiet accountant, built a website. 2 teenage volunteers made TikToks under the hashtag Majer, Barn of the Free. Attendance soared. People brought their kids. Someone brought a guitar. We even hosted a potluck with more dishes than chairs. Someone gifted us a plaque that read, "Where 2 or more are gathered in resistance, there is righteousness." I hung it behind the pulpit. The hearing came, packed house, Karen in full pearls and blazer mode. HOA's attorney, young, smug, overconfident, argued that my faith was invented, and thus undeserving of protection. That's when Nathan stood and slowly read from the 2005 Supreme Court ruling cutter, Verrio. "Wilkinson government may not question the validity or sincerity of religious belief if those beliefs are not illegal or directly harmful." Then he added, "No court in this country has ever required theology to be traditional in order to be protected." The room went silent. Karen flushed, then whispered something to her lawyer. The board took a recess, came back 10 minutes later, and ruled 5-0. My status stood, the barn was protected, the HOA was overruled, and Karen, she stormed out. Again. We sang that Sunday. No hymnals, just voices, and a whole lot of joy. There's a strange quiet that follows victory. Not silence, just a kind of stillness. Like the land itself is waiting to see what you'll do now that the shouting's stopped. The week after Karen Delaney stepped down, the HOA didn't collapse. It paused. For the first time in years, no violation letters were sent. No meetings were held. No threats were issued over mailboxes or garden gnomes. It was as if the system that had once roared suddenly remembered how to listen. And that was when we had a choice. Let the system rot, or rebuild it into something that served the people it claimed to protect. I gathered a few neighbors, Cheryl, Mike, even Henry Morton with his spreadsheets, and we sat under the barn rafters, sipping coffee and staring at a blank whiteboard. "This isn't just about revenge," I said. "It's about never letting this happen again." Cheryl nodded. "We make it transparent, accountable, optional, if needed." Henry raised a hand. "I'd like to propose we remove the term compliance from all titles. Unanimous approval. That month, we rewrote the Deerwood Crossing HOA charter. We held open meetings. We published minutes online. We instituted term limits. We canceled dozens of unnecessary fines and returned funds that had been collected under false pretenses. Lisa Tran, who'd once been fined for planting non-compliant hydrangeas, was elected the new board president, her first act issuing a formal apology to every homeowner for the years of top-down overreach and unneighborly behavior. She delivered it in the barn, standing beneath the rafters, facing people who used to whisper, now applauding. But the reform wasn't just structural, it was cultural. People stopped hiding behind hedges and started knocking on each other's doors again. Neighbors who'd once only exchanged glares over fence lines now shared tools, recipes, and stories. One man, Bill from Lot 94, admitted that he'd once reported me for unauthorized ladder usage. Then he brought me a pie. It wasn't very good, but the gesture, it was perfect. We kept the HOA Free Fellowship going, not because we needed legal protection anymore, but because people wanted to come, some for reflection, some for music, some just for peace. It wasn't religion in the traditional sense. It was community in the truest one. Even the zoning board sent a note. Thank you for showing us what shared space really looks like. One afternoon, as we painted new signs for the barn, Cheryl looked up and said, "You think your dad would be proud I didn't answer immediately." I looked at the hill where the old oak stood, where he used to watch storms roll in with a quiet patience. Then I nodded. "Yeah," I said, "but he'd probably ask why I didn't do it sooner." We laughed. A year after the first flyer landed in my mailbox, we held a town potluck on the barn lawn. Over 200 people showed up. Someone smoked brisket. Someone else brought tamales. There was a bluegrass trio on the makeshift stage. And I gave the shortest sermon I've ever written. Just 3 lines fences can divide, or they can remind us where respect begins. It's up to us. Afterward, Cheryl handed me a framed picture. The barn at sunset, doors open, string lights glowing, beneath it, in neat handwriting, not just a barn, a beginning. I didn't hang it in the house. I hung it right inside the barn, beside the wall of witness, not as a trophy, but as a promise. Because in the end, the real victory wasn't over Karen. It wasn't legal or political. It wasn't even personal. It was the rediscovery of something small and rare, that when neighbors stand together, not in uniformity, but in mutual respect. No HOA, no paper tyrant, no whispered threat can break them apart. And all it took was one barn, one line, and the will to hold it. They say land doesn't remember names, only deeds. But I don't believe that anymore. I believe this land remembers everything who worked it, who fought for it, who tried to sell it out with a forged easement and a handshake in a boardroom, and most of all, who stayed. It's been over a year since the first violation letter landed in my mailbox. A year since I was told my barn was non-compliant. Since I was told that tradition, family, and history were a threat to someone else's property value. I still have that letter, framed right next to the final vote of the HOA reform charter. They sit side by side on the barn wall, like bookends to a chapter I never planned to write. Most Sundays, we still meet. Not always with sermons. Sometimes it's just coffee and old vinyl records. Sometimes it's a neighborhood kid playing a folk song on a guitar that's older than he is. Sometimes it's silence. Cricket still runs the perimeter like she owns the place. And she kinda does. Once in a while, a stranger will stop by, someone who read about us, or watched the documentary Jennifer put together, or maybe just got tired of being told what color their mailbox could be. They walk in, look around, and ask, "Is this really it?" I smile and say, "It is." And it's enough, because it is. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. I think that's what scared them most, back at the start. Not the sermons, not the Constitution quotes, not even the barn, just the honesty, the unwillingness to lie down, the audacity to stand still when everything around you demands compromise. One evening, just as the sun was dropping behind the hills, I stood by the barn's open doors and watched the light pour across the floorboards. Same place where my father used to sharpen tools. Same place where I once thought I was going to lose everything. And I thought about how easy it is to give up land, not just the soil beneath your feet, but your claim to live by your own principles. All it takes is one signature, one silence, one fine, have it your way. But holding on, that takes something else. Not anger, not even stubbornness, conviction. Sometimes I still hear Karen's voice in the back of my head. "This isn't over, Mr. Griggs." Maybe it isn't. Maybe somewhere out there, there's another HOA with another clipboard, drawing another red line around someone else's history. But I hope if they do, that person has a barn, a friend, a dog, and a good printer for legal paperwork. They called it a war, the barn war, but it was never about battles. It was about boundaries, and how sometimes, saying this far, no further is the most sacred thing you can do. So here's what I learned. If you stand long enough, others will start to stand beside you. If you speak clearly enough, the noise eventually fades. And if you refuse to fold, even when you're outnumbered, outspent, and outmaneuvered, sometimes the land itself folds back around you, like it remembers who you are. Because names may fade, but fences, Fences remember, if this story made you laugh, rage, or rethink every fence post on your property, share it. This is the HOA Karen Files, where we document every clipboard crusader, every bogus citation, and every backyard rebellion. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and if your HOA is acting up, drop us a story. Because freedom's not in the fine print, it's in the footnotes of resistance. And out here, we read everything.